It was an ordinary day in Space Monitoring Command, the kind that started with silence and ended with the same. Machines hummed quietly as they scanned the endless darkness beyond Neptune. The team on duty didn't expect anything unusual. Most of the time, they just watched patterns of static, harmless bursts of radiation and distant signals from dying stars. But then one of the operators noticed something strange, a rhythm. It wasn't random noise. It repeated, paused, repeated again, almost like it was trying to say something. At first, no one took it seriously. Space was full of strange sounds, background radiation, cosmic interference, and glitches caused by solar winds. The operator ran a diagnostic test, thinking maybe a sensor had malfunctioned. But the signal didn't stop. It pulsed again, steady, almost desperate. The technician frowned and called for a supervisor. Soon a small group gathered around the main screen, their eyes fixed on the strange sequence. It wasn't a natural pattern. It had structure. And behind that structure, intent. The data was immediately sent to Earth's Deep Space Communications Center for analysis. Within minutes, the room that had been silent for years was now alive with tension. Scientists worked side by side, decoding the transmission, checking for human origin codes. Nothing matched. It wasn't a military test, not a satellite beacon, not even an echo from an old probe. The signal was alien, and worse, it sounded like a cry for help. The lead scientist, Dr. Alara Mendez, listened to the cleaned-up recording. It wasn't in any human language, yet the pattern carried emotion. It rose and fell like a voice trembling under fear. There was rhythm, urgency, and pain in it, something unmistakably alive. Her hands trembled slightly as she replayed the message again and again. "It's not random," she whispered. "Someone's trying to reach us." The message spread quickly through official channels. At first, the government tried to keep it quiet. They didn't want panic. But rumors travel fast, especially among scientists. Soon, whispers began to circulate in observatories, universities, and defense networks. An SOS had been detected from beyond the solar system. It wasn't just a strange signal. It was intelligent. Someone, somewhere out there, was asking for help. In the following hours, humanity's most powerful telescopes turned their eyes toward the direction of the signal. The coordinates pointed to a star system thousands of light years away. The source was faint but persistent, repeating every 4 minutes, never-changing rhythm. It was almost as if whoever sent it was trapped, waiting, hoping someone would hear before it was too late. The control rooms around the world were filled with tension. People spoke in low voices, afraid to believe what was unfolding. Could it be real? Could another civilization truly exist and be close enough to reach out? The thought was overwhelming. For centuries, humanity had looked to the stars, wondering if anyone else was out there. Now the answer had come, not as a friendly greeting, but as a desperate cry. In a dimly lit conference hall in Geneva, the United Earth Council held an emergency session. Military advisors, scientists, and diplomats sat around the long glass table, their faces pale with disbelief. The head of the council, President Amir Kadim, spoke slowly, trying to steady his voice. "We've confirmed it's not a human transmission. The signal is consistent with intelligent origin. It repeats the same structure, a distress pattern." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Someone is asking for help." The room was silent. Some looked amazed, others terrified. If the message was genuine, it meant humanity was no longer alone in the universe. But it also meant that whoever sent the message was in danger, and close enough to reach them. The question that followed hung heavy in the air. Should Earth answer? While leaders debated, people around the world began to sense that something historic had happened. News leaked. The phrase alien SOS began trending on every network within hours. Some thought it was a hoax, others prayed it was real. A few even feared it was a trap. But among the scientists and engineers who had listened to the original transmission, there was no doubt. The fear in that signal was real. It carried the same emotional weight as a human scream echoing through space. In the Neptune station where it all began, the original team stayed awake for 3 straight days, monitoring every pulse, every fluctuation. The more they studied it, the more they felt connected to whoever was sending it. One technician, a quiet young man named Ryan, stared at the data long after his shift ended. "They must be terrified," he murmured. "Imagine sending a signal into the dark, not knowing if anyone will ever hear it." The senior officer placed a hand on his shoulder. "We heard them," she said softly. That's what matters. Outside the windows of the station, Neptune's pale blue glow drifted through the darkness. The stars beyond it looked colder than ever, and yet for the first time they didn't feel empty. Somewhere out there beyond that endless black ocean, a voice had reached them. Someone had called out and humanity had heard. Back on Earth, research centers worked without rest. Linguists tried to decode the structure. Mathematicians searched for hidden messages in the pulse timing. Cryptographers compared it to human distress codes. Everyone wanted to know what it said. Some experts thought it was a call from a stranded ship. Others believed it was a last message from a dying planet. But no one could deny the tone. Urgency, fear, and hope mixed together in a pattern that no natural event could create. Night after night, people around the world stood under the open sky, looking up at the stars. For generations, humanity had wondered if they were alone. Now they had an answer, and it changed everything. Scientists felt awe, soldiers felt responsibility, and ordinary people felt something deeper, a connection. The universe was no longer silent. It was alive, and someone out there needed help. As the hours turned into days, the signal continued, unchanged, unwavering. It was faint but constant, proof that whoever sent it hadn't given up. Humanity had always been a species that refused to ignore a cry for help. The world might argue about politics, beliefs, and power, but this was different. This was life calling out through the void, and deep within the listening post near Neptune, a single light blinked every few seconds, in rhythm with the alien SOS. The team watched it with quiet reverence. The cold silence of space wasn't silent anymore. It carried a voice, a plea, and with every pulse that reached their receivers, humanity understood a little more. They weren't just listening to noise. They were listening to fear, to courage, and to hope from a world they had never known. For the first time in human history, the vast darkness between stars didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Someone somewhere was waiting. And humanity, for all its flaws, knew one thing deep in its collective heart. They could not ignore that call. When the signal was finally verified as real, the world changed in a single moment. The message from the stars was no longer a mystery or rumor. It was a confirmed fact. Someone somewhere far away was calling for help. The confirmation spread through secret channels first. Scientists who had studied the signal looked pale and shaken, and military communication lines lit up all across the planet. It wasn't just an alien sound anymore. It was a plea, a distress call, one that couldn't be ignored. Within hours, the United Earth Council called for an emergency meeting. The great glass dome of the council hall in Geneva was filled with tension. Representatives from every major nation, generals from the Earth Defense Force, and top scientists from the Space Agency sat together, staring at the holographic projection of the alien signal. The rhythmic pulses floated above the table like a heartbeat, cold and mechanical yet filled with emotion. For hours, no one spoke. Then slowly the debates began. Some leaders argued for caution. "We don't know who they are," said one diplomat. "They could be dangerous. This could be a trap." Others disagreed. "If they were hostile, why send a distress call?" asked a scientist. "They're desperate. Maybe dying. If we do nothing, they could vanish forever." The arguments went on and on. Some feared it was an alien trick designed to lure humanity into war. Others believed it was destiny, that this was the moment Earth had waited for since the first telescope pointed toward the stars. The discussions grew heated, voices echoing through the hall. They spoke of risk, morality, and the consequences of getting involved. Was it humanity's place to interfere? Could they afford not to? In the middle of it all sat President Amir Kadim, watching in silence. His hands were folded tightly, his mind replaying the sound of that signal. He remembered the recordings of human history, the cries for help that had gone unanswered during times of war and disaster. Earth had seen suffering, and it had learned painfully what it meant to be ignored. Finally, he stood. The room fell silent. "We have heard them," he said quietly, "and we know what it feels like to be unheard." Those words changed everything. The hall went quiet, not out of fear but out of realization. Humanity had come a long way from its violent past, but the lessons of compassion, of unity, were written in its scars. They couldn't turn away from a cry for help. Not now, not when the whole universe was watching. One by one, the representatives nodded. There were no cheers, no applause, just a heavy silence of understanding. The decision was made. Earth would answer the call. They would help. But humanity's version of help had never been gentle. When the official order was given, the world's defense networks activated instantly. In massive orbital shipyards that had stood silent for decades, lights flickered to life. The old warships, massive steel-gray giants built during Earth's age of interplanetary conflict, were reactivated. Hangar doors that hadn't opened in years began to slide apart, revealing rows upon rows of ships waiting in the dark. Engineers flooded the docks, dusting off forgotten systems, recharging reactors, and refitting engines for deep space travel. The hum of machines echoed through every bay. The air smelled of oil, ozone, and urgency. Humanity was moving faster than ever before. They didn't know who they were going to save or what they would face when they got there, but they knew they had to go. In the skies above Earth, formation lights began to blink as ships powered up one by one. The night sky glowed faintly with the blue light of plasma drives. Families stood on rooftops watching as the first ships rose from the atmosphere, their engines leaving trails like falling stars in reverse. For many, it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing they had ever seen. In the command centers, officers gave orders with steady voices, but everyone could feel the tension. No one knew how far the signal source was, or whether the fleet could even reach it in time. But every technician, every engineer, every pilot knew the same truth. Someone out there needed them. And that was enough. The preparation wasn't just military, it was emotional. Across the world, news of the rescue mission spread. Some people prayed. Others cried. Children asked their parents if the aliens were good or bad. The parents had no answer. They only said, "We're going to help them." Humanity, a species once divided by borders and war, now stood united under one purpose. In orbit, the shipyards became cities of light. Drones zipped between vessels carrying supplies, food, medicine, communication systems, and weapons. The Earth fleet wasn't designed for mercy missions. It was built for survival, for protection, and for power. But this time, its weapons weren't meant for conquest. They were shields for the helpless. Commander Rhea Solari, one of the fleet captains, stood on the bridge of her ship. The solstice dawn as systems came online. The hum of the reactor filled the air. "So it's true," she said softly to her second in command. "We're really going to another world." The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am." A distress call. And we're the answer. Down below in the factories and refueling stations, thousands of workers labored without rest. Every hand on Earth contributed. Miners, programmers, pilots, and scientists. The whole planet moved as one machine. The spirit of unity, once only seen during times of war, had returned. But this time it wasn't to destroy. It was to protect. Days turned into nights, and the preparations neared completion. The fleet that once existed only as a symbol of defense now stood ready for its first mission, beyond the edge of human space. More than 300 ships, from sleek scout frigates to massive carrier vessels, waited in high orbit. Their hulls gleamed under the sunlight. They were old, but reliable, each one a piece of human history reborn. In the final meeting before launch, President Kadim addressed the fleet commanders through a secure transmission. His face appeared on every bridge screen, calm and firm. "We are not sending diplomats," he said. "We are sending guardians. We are not going to conquer, but to protect. Let this be the moment that defines humanity, not by what we take, but by who we choose to be." Those words spread across every ship, every crew member. There was fear, yes, but also pride. Humanity was stepping into the unknown, ready to fight not for themselves, but for someone they had never met. It was an act of courage, of compassion, and of power combined. As the countdown to departure began, the massive engines of the flagship ignited, shaking the void with light. The fleet lifted slowly, then gathered formation in the upper atmosphere. Below them, Earth glowed blue and alive, a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. Not just for themselves, but for anyone who needed saving. For the first time, humanity wasn't sending aid convoys or messages of peace. They weren't sending scientists or politicians. They were sending warriors, engineers, and dreamers, all united under a single purpose. Humanity wasn't going to watch the galaxy suffer in silence. They were going to do what they had always done when faced with the impossible. Act. The engines roared. The fleet began to move, and somewhere far beyond the stars, the faint pulse of the alien SOS continued to echo through the darkness, unaware that the most dangerous and determined species in the galaxy was on its way. Across the solar system, the silence of space was broken by the awakening of giants. Massive ships long asleep in orbiting docks began to hum with energy. Old engines coughed to life after decades of stillness, glowing faintly like the hearts of sleeping beasts stirred awake. In shipyards around Mars, the Moon, and the asteroid colonies, workers watched as ancient war machines came alive once more. These were vessels once built for defense, weapons forged during a time when humanity feared only itself. But now they had a new purpose, and not to destroy but to protect. It began quietly at first. Engineers reactivated fusion cores, technicians walked through dusty corridors of forgotten ships, and robots carried new parts to replace what time had corroded. The work never stopped. The command came from the United Earth Council. All available fleets were to be repurposed under a single mission, Project Sentinel. Every worker, pilot, and commander understood the gravity of that name. Humanity was no longer preparing for war against its own kind. It was preparing to save someone else's. The scale of the operation was unlike anything in history. Massive orbital stations buzzed with constant traffic as ships were repaired, upgraded, and armed. The shipyards that circled Mars glowed red in the reflection of the planet's surface, while factories on the Moon ran day and night, sending endless cargo to the docks. Every vessel, from small scout ships to colossal carriers, was given new coordinates, new orders, and a single mission: answer the call for help that came from beyond the stars. In every hangar, there were scenes of both chaos and determination. Mechanics shouted over the roar of plasma welders, pilots ran through simulation drills, and soldiers checked equipment that hadn't been touched in years. Some ships still bore the scars of old battles: burn marks, patched hulls, faded insignias. They looked tired, but the crews who boarded them felt pride. These ships were more than machines. They were symbols of what humanity had become: strong, stubborn, and unwilling to let another world suffer alone. Families gathered at the departure bays, watching as their loved ones prepared to leave. Children clung to their parents' uniforms, spouses exchanged quiet promises, and friends gave last embraces. No one knew if the crews would return. The distances were unimaginable and the dangers unknown. Yet every pilot and Marine who stepped aboard knew what was at stake. Someone out there was dying, and humanity was their only hope. The message was simple, repeated in every transmission, every briefing, and every speech: we are not conquerors. We are protectors. That sentence became the heart of Project Sentinel. It echoed through radio channels, command centers, and even the homes of ordinary people watching from Earth. Humanity had finally found something larger than itself, a mission that united everyone. From the poorest mechanic on Luna to the highest general in orbit, commanders held briefings across the fleet. They explained what little was known about the situation: an alien colony under attack, far beyond the edge of human space. The details were scarce, the risks enormous, but it didn't matter. Every soul who joined Project Sentinel knew the truth. When someone cries for help, you answer. It was not just a mission. It was a test of what humanity truly stood for. As the days passed, the spaceports became living cities of metal and fire. Thousands of ships lined up in formation, their hulls shining against the blackness of space. The hum of engines filled the void, a sound that carried both fear and hope. Massive command carriers floated like mountains among stars, surrounded by smaller escort ships and freighters packed with supplies. It was a sight both beautiful and intimidating, a display of power born not from greed but from compassion. To the people on Earth, watching the launch broadcasts felt surreal. Billions tuned in as cameras showed the fleets rising one by one into orbit. Some wept, others cheered. No one could remember a time when humanity had been this united. On every screen, the insignia of Project Sentinel glowed, a single silver shield set against a field of stars. It was more than an emblem. It was a promise. In homes, schools, and cities, people whispered stories of courage. They're going to save someone, parents told their children. Out there, far away, there are lives depending on them. Children drew pictures of starships and brave crews flying through the galaxy. Hope spread like fire through the hearts of everyone who had once thought humanity's time of greatness was long gone. For the crews aboard the ships, there was no time for rest. The final preparations were intense. Cargo bays filled with supplies, food, medicine, repair drones, and weapons. The medics checked their equipment, engineers fine-tuned reactor outputs, and captains reviewed flight paths. Every task mattered. Every second counted. The sense of purpose was so strong that it almost drowned out the fear. Still, in the quiet moments before departure, doubt lingered. What if they were too late? What if the signal had already stopped? No one could say for sure. But humanity had learned long ago that inaction was worse than failure. Even if they arrived to find only silence, they would know they had tried. That thought alone kept them going. On Mars, the largest ship ever built, the Aegis Prime, began powering up. Its engines burned brighter than any sunrise, visible even from the colony domes below. It would serve as the flagship of the mission, leading the entire fleet into the unknown. Its captain, Admiral Rhea Solari, stood on the bridge, looking out at the red planet beneath her. "We leave not for war," she said softly to her crew, "but for hope." Her words were broadcast to every vessel across the fleet. A silence followed, then the comms filled with quiet acknowledgments, calm, steady voices ready to face whatever awaited them. Soon, every ship reported ready. The command to launch came from Earth itself. One by one, the engines ignited. The void filled with light as hundreds of ships accelerated outward, leaving behind glowing trails across the stars. From Earth's surface, they looked like comets rising to defend the heavens. People stood in open fields, on rooftops, on beaches, staring up as the sky lit with streaks of blue fire. They knew this was history being written, the moment when humanity answered the first call beyond its world. It was terrifying to think of what might happen next, but even more beautiful to know that they were not standing by. Back in orbit, as the last ship cleared the docking station, a deep voice came over the fleet's channel. "This is Project Sentinel Command. All vessels are clear. Begin formation burn. For Earth, for the lost, for the living." The fleet began to move in perfect synchronization, hundreds of steel titans gliding silently into the darkness. The stars stretched ahead of them like a vast ocean, unknown and endless. But they weren't afraid. They carried with them the hopes of billions, the belief that no life, no matter how distant, should be left to die alone. For those left behind, watching from the safety of their homes, the sight of the fleet disappearing into the black sky was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. Parents held their children close. Soldiers saluted. Scientists whispered prayers. And somewhere deep inside, every human felt the same realization. This was not just a mission. It was the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's story. The fleets that once existed as symbols of fear had become something far greater. They were no longer machines of destruction, but messengers of compassion. And as they vanished into the void, guided by courage and duty, the universe itself seemed to listen. Humanity had heard the cry of another world, and answered not with words but with action. After weeks of travel through the silent darkness, humanity's fleet finally reached the edge of the dying star system. The journey had been long, quiet, and heavy with expectation. Every crew member had stared out at the endless black void, wondering what waited for them on the other side of that faint signal. The star that lit the system was weak and trembling, its light dim and red, casting a dull glow across shattered planets and drifting debris. Even before the fleet slowed down, the sensors began to detect wreckage, burned ships, ruined satellites, and broken colonies. The SOS signal was still there, faint but steady, like the heartbeat of someone clinging to life. As the fleet approached, the truth became clear. The signal came from a small colony world, orbiting a scorched planet with a thin, dying atmosphere. What was once a home for thousands of living beings had become a graveyard of smoke and fire. The alien colony was under siege. Swarms of enemy ships surrounded it, firing down at the surface again and again. The attackers were ruthless, their energy beams burning through everything that moved. They weren't just trying to conquer the colony. They were trying to erase it. Human commanders watched the live feeds in silence. The aliens below were small and fragile-looking, their cities made of glass and stone rather than metal. Their ships were simple, outdated by human standards. They didn't even have proper shields to protect themselves. They were peaceful beings, clearly never built for war. They had tried to defend themselves, but their resistance was hopeless. They were centuries behind in technology, and their attackers knew it. Whole districts were already gone, wiped out in seconds. The sight of it filled every human on board with quiet fury. The command bridge of the Aegis Prime fell into dead silence as Admiral Rhea Solari stared at the screen. Her voice when it came was calm but sharp. "They're exterminating them," she said. "No negotiation, no warning." Her second-in-command looked at her, waiting for the next words. She didn't hesitate. "All ships, prepare for combat." That one sentence changed everything. The fleet spread out in formation, engines flaring blue as they moved into attack position. Human warships had never entered alien space before, but hesitation was not part of their nature. They had come all this way for one purpose: to stop the slaughter. The enemy ships detected the human fleet seconds later. Confusion spread among them. They weren't expecting company, much less hundreds of heavily armed vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel. Before they could react, the human flagship sent a final transmission to all ships. "Engage." What followed was chaos, swift, brutal, and one-sided. The first human salvo hit the enemy lines like a hammer. Massive kinetic rounds and plasma bolts tore through enemy hulls. In seconds, entire squadrons vanished in blinding flashes. The human ships moved with precision, their formations tight and coordinated. They didn't fight like conquerors. They fought like rescuers, cold and focused, destroying only what threatened the colony below. Enemy commanders screamed across their comms, trying to regroup, but they had never faced a death-world species before. A civilization born from constant struggle, evolution, and survival against all odds. Humanity's instincts were sharp and merciless when it came to defending life. Every crew member fought with purpose, not for territory, not for power, but for the lives of strangers who had called for help. On the surface, the aliens looked up through the burning skies and saw something they didn't understand. The clouds split open with thunder, and beams of blue light cut through the darkness. Enemy ships that had been bombarding their cities suddenly exploded one by one, burning trails across the sky. For the first time in months, the bombardment stopped. The survivors watched as massive shadows, human warships, appeared above the clouds, blocking out the dying sun. To them, it looked like gods had descended from the heavens. But these weren't gods. They were humans, angry, determined, and unstoppable. In orbit, the battle continued with terrifying precision. Human destroyers cut through enemy formations, disabling their weapons, targeting their command ships first. Every maneuver was clean, calculated, and fast. The attackers tried to retreat, but humanity's fleet had already surrounded them. Escape was impossible. Within hours, the enemy armada was in ruins. The few ships that tried to flee were disabled rather than destroyed. Humanity didn't kill for pleasure, only for necessity. When the last enemy guns fell silent, the fleet held position. The command channels filled with reports, damage minimal, casualties low. The operation had been a complete success. But the silence that followed was heavy. They had seen what had been done to the colony. Entire cities reduced to ashes, entire families gone. Even victory felt bitter. Admiral Solari gave the next order softly. "Deploy relief teams." Dropships broke away from the fleet, descending toward the surface like silver rain. Medical teams, engineers, and soldiers moved together, bringing aid and security. The survivors below stared in disbelief as tall, armored humans stepped out of their ships carrying supplies, generators, and medicine. They expected conquerors. Instead, they found protectors. One alien, barely standing, tried to speak through a translator. You came for us?" The human medic only nodded and said, "We heard your call." Those simple words spread quickly among the survivors. The humans had come from another world, not for war or conquest, but to save them. And yet the power they carried was terrifying. Fleets that could destroy entire armies, weapons that could tear through mountains. The aliens didn't know whether to fear or worship them. Above the planet, the fleet remained in high orbit, standing guard like silent sentinels. The crews watched as rescue operations continued, feeling both pride and sadness. They had done what they came to do. They had answered the SOS, but the cost they had witnessed would stay with them forever. On every ship, the story spread, the peaceful colony that had been nearly wiped out, and how humanity had arrived in time. The soldiers spoke of the look in the survivors' eyes, fear turning into hope. The engineers spoke of the destruction, of how fragile the alien cities had been. The medics spoke of gratitude, of small, trembling hands holding theirs. Across the system, human ships patrolled the edges of the battlefield, ensuring no enemy forces returned. In the quiet that followed, the void felt heavier, as if even space itself was processing what had just happened. Humanity had proven something to the galaxy that day, something powerful and dangerous. For the first time in known history, a death-world species, beings evolved from struggle, forged by hardship, and capable of immense violence, had used their power not for domination but for protection. They had brought peace through fire, safety through war. To the rescued aliens it was salvation. To the rest of the galaxy it was a warning. The message spread fast through interstellar channels. Witnesses described it in awe. The humans came out of the dark. They moved like thunder. They did not come to talk. They came to save. And far above the quiet colony, among the wreckage of the destroyed enemy fleet, the human ships remained, steady, vigilant, watching over the fragile world below. For humanity, it was just the beginning. They had seen suffering beyond their own world, and they knew now that their strength, their unity, and their will to fight could mean more than survival. It could mean hope. When the dust finally settled, the alien survivors stood among the ruins of their world, staring at the sky in disbelief. The battle was over. The constant roar of explosions had gone silent. The enemy ships that had filled their sky only hours ago were gone, broken apart, burning or drifting lifelessly in orbit. The ground trembled no more. For the first time in weeks there was quiet. They could hardly understand what had happened. One moment they had been preparing to die, their defenses shattered and their cities burning. Then suddenly thunder had come from the heavens, and the attackers were gone. The skies that had once rained fire now carried the shining forms of human ships, silent and steady, watching over the planet like guardians. The survivors didn't know whether to fall to their knees or run in fear. When the humans came down again, it wasn't with weapons drawn. They came with food, medicine, and machines that restored power and light to the broken colony. The aliens stared in silence as the towering humans moved through the ruins, helping the wounded, burying the dead, and rebuilding homes. The humans spoke little. Their faces were hard, their armor scarred with battle damage, but their actions were kind. To the survivors, it made no sense. Why would such a powerful species, one that could destroy entire fleets in a few hours, come to help a small, weak colony? They had nothing to offer. No wealth, no resources, not even strategic value. Their world was dying, their people few. They expected demands, conditions, something in return. But when the alien leaders approached the human commander to ask what humanity wanted, the answer stunned them. Nothing, she said simply. Just remember, that was all. No tribute, no claim of ownership, no demand for loyalty. The humans didn't stay long after that. They left supplies, medical equipment, and technology to help the aliens rebuild. Then they prepared their ships and began to leave the system one by one. Before they left, the human admiral stood before the surviving alien council and spoke only once more. "Next time you send a signal like that," she said, "you won't have to be afraid. Because we'll come." The words echoed in the council chamber long after she was gone. When the last human ship disappeared into the void, the colony felt an emptiness in the sky. It was peaceful now, but also strange, as if the humans had taken the storm with them. The survivors began to rebuild their homes with quiet determination. They told their children stories of the great metal angels who had come from the stars, who had fought the darkness and brought back the light. Some called them saviors, others whispered another word: Deathworlders. As the colony healed, the story began to spread. Merchant ships carried it to neighboring systems, and travelers repeated it in hushed tones across stations and outposts. The tale of the humans who had answered a cry for help, and brought war with them, reached every corner of the galaxy. At first, many didn't believe it. They said it was impossible. No civilized species would send an entire fleet just to protect strangers. But the reports kept coming. Satellite images, recordings, eyewitness accounts. The evidence was undeniable. The humans of Earth had detected an SOS signal and responded not with diplomats or traders, but with warships, an armada powerful enough to wipe out a small empire. The galaxy had known of humanity before, a young, rising race from a harsh planet, known for their strange resilience and fierce adaptability. But this was different. This was the first time they had seen what happened when humanity decided to protect someone. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't peaceful. It was overwhelming. Across the stars, leaders gathered to discuss it. Some were impressed, others terrified. One senator from a distant world said, "They fight like monsters, but for the right reasons." Another replied, "Then what happens when they think we're the wrong reason?" And so began the whispers. Some called humanity heroes, protectors of the weak, defenders of peace. They saw the humans as a species with strong morals, willing to risk their own lives to stop cruelty. For them, the story was one of hope, proof that goodness could still exist in a cold and ruthless galaxy. But others saw something darker. They spoke of the scale of destruction, the precision with which human ships had annihilated the enemy. They said humanity's mercy came wrapped in violence, that their version of protection left nothing standing. These voices warned that the Deathworlders from Earth were not saviors. They were storms. They might save you today, but tomorrow they could turn their fury elsewhere. The debate spread across the galaxy like wildfire. News networks replayed the battle footage endlessly. Scholars analyzed human tactics, trying to understand how a relatively young species could wield such terrifying force with such discipline. Some said it was instinct, born from a world where survival was constant struggle. Others said it was emotion, an empathy so deep that when they saw suffering, they couldn't just watch. The rescued aliens themselves remained silent. They did not correct anyone. They simply built monuments to the humans who had saved them. Tall, shining spires carved with the words, "They came when no one else would." Years later, when travelers passed through that system, they would stop and look at those monuments. They would hear the story from the locals, told with a mix of gratitude and awe. And every time it ended the same way. When humanity hears an SOS, they come. But they don't come with words. They come with fire. Back on Earth, the fleet's return was quiet. There were no grand celebrations or medals. The crews simply went home, carrying with them the memory of what they had seen. The burned cities, the faces of the rescued, the silence of victory. They knew what they had done was right, but it didn't feel glorious. War never did. Still, the thought that somewhere out there lives had been saved was enough. In the following years, more distress signals were detected across different sectors. Sometimes it was pirates, sometimes wars, sometimes natural disasters. Each time the humans responded. Sometimes they sent aid ships, sometimes fleets. And every time the message spread further. When Deathworlders detect a cry for help, they do not hesitate. They do not negotiate. They come. No one knew whether to feel safe or afraid of that truth. To some, it meant hope, that no matter how small or powerless you were, somewhere out there was a species that would stand up for you. To others, it meant fear, because that same species could unleash unimaginable destruction in the name of mercy. But there was one truth that no one could deny anymore. Humanity's mercy was not soft. It was forged in the fire of their world, a world that had taught them that peace sometimes required strength, and compassion sometimes demanded war. They were the children of a planet that had tried to kill them every day of their existence. And yet they had learned not only to survive but to protect. And so, when they looked at the suffering of others, they didn't look away. They acted, swiftly, completely, and without hesitation. And as the story continued to echo across the stars, a new phrase was born, whispered in every corner of the galaxy, from high councils to dark taverns. When humanity detects an SOS, they don't come in peace alone. They come with vengeance wrapped in mercy. It was not a threat. It was a promise, one that every civilization would remember for a very, very long time.